Hello, it's Wednesday the 13th of April and you're watching Scotland at 7. I'm Hugh Stewart. Thank you for joining us tonight. And on the line, I'll be discussing today's news with Member of Parliament Richard Thomson, who's in Gordon. I guess that's where you are just now, in the northeast of Scotland. Good afternoon or good evening.
Indeed. Good evening, Hugh.
Right, so if you wouldn't mind waiting, we will discuss the news. But first of all, Richard, we're going to, as is now customary, on day 49 of Putin's attack on Ukraine. We're going to look through the main bullet points that we've heard today. First of all, US President Joe Biden has labelled Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide, saying that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to wipe out the idea of being able to be Ukrainian. Biden made the remarks to reporters as he prepared to board Air Force One to return to Washington after an event on the economy in Iowa. Putin's closest ally in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk, has been captured by Ukrainian law enforcement, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced. Medvedchuk is the leader of the opposition Platform for Life, Ukraine's biggest opposition party. Zelensky proposed releasing him to Russia in exchange for Ukrainians captured by Russian forces. Zelensky said it's not yet possible to draw 100% conclusions about what kind of substance was used in Mariupol on Tuesday. Earlier, he voiced concerns that the Russian forces were preparing a new stage of terror which could involve the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. Civilians have fled eastern Ukraine in advance of a widely forecast attack, and the Russian forces closed in on the ruins of the southern city of Mariupol. Ukrainian forces were preparing for a new Russian offensive in the east of the country, with the governor of Luhansk, Serhiy Gaidai, urging residents to evacuate as soon as possible using agreed humanitarian corridors. The mayor of the Ukrainian town of Bucha, near Kyiv, said that authorities had so far found 403 bodies of people they believe were killed by Russian forces during their occupation of the area. That number was still growing. Anatoly Fedoruk said, adding that it was too early for residents to return to the town. That's Anatoly Fedoruk is the mayor of that town, Bucha. President Putin of Russia said Ukraine had deviated from the agreements made at the peace conference in Istanbul and that talks were at a dead end. When asked about the Russian president's comments, a member of the Ukrainian delegation, Mikhail Podolyak, said negotiations with the Russians were very hard, but were continuing. Vladimir Putin also claimed that Russia's military operation was going as planned, and that Russia's aim in Ukraine was to meet all its goals and minimise losses. The World Bank is planning financial support to Ukraine worth $1.5 billion, that's approximately £1.2 billion, to help keep critical services running as the country fights a fresh assault by Russia. The bank said funds would be used to support the continuation of key government services. President Zelensky rejected the request by the German President Franz-Walter Steinmeier to visit Kyiv along with other European politicians on Wednesday, that's today, according to a report in the German newspaper Bild. The reason for a denial was the German Social Democrats' previously close ties to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his history as an advocate of close Russian-German economic ties. Well, Richard, just before we move on to the next story, which is also about Ukraine, on that last point, do you think a lot of politicians in Europe are now beginning to regret their attitude to Putin up to last year?
Well, if they're not, they certainly ought to be. I mean, one of the most high profile is the former Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, who has links with Russian energy entities. And I think that there's been the understandable euphoria that there was with the end of the Cold War and the collapsing of the Iron Curtain and the opportunities that were thought to be at that time for Russia to develop into a democracy with a fully functioning market economy. Along the way, people have allowed themselves to suspend their critical faculties at the flawed leaders that they've had over that time, and never more so than with Vladimir Putin. I think it was always highly debatable whether somebody who came from a background as a senior official in the KGB was ever going to be committed to anything other than the most authoritarian kind of rule, and the crude populism that he's used at home to bolster his position should have left nobody in any doubt. But Gerhard Schroeder's not the only person who should be left rueing that situation. We have got plenty cause to rue it in Scotland, and others have in the UK as well. The Conservative Party has been awash in a sea of dodgy Russian cash now for quite some time, and there's no part of it that has been untouched. Lubov Chernyukin is a name that pops up frequently. She paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to have a game of tennis with Boris Johnson. She even paid to have lunch with Ruth Davidson while she was still leader of the Scottish Conservative Party. And while we believe that the lunch has never taken place, I think it just shows how far the reach of Russian money and influence has gone. And of course, there are still layers to reveal in terms of the interference that there was round about the Brexit referendum and the way that a war of misinformation has been fought on social media and on other platforms. So, yeah, I think there are a number of politicians in continental Europe, in the UK, and perhaps even closer to home, who would have cause to regret their links to the Russian state.
Yep, indeed. I think definitely the Russian charm offensive certainly seems to be over now. Now let's move back to Mariupol. Today we've heard that the Russians have claimed that over 1,000 Ukrainian Marines have surrendered. The story is that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines who were defending the besieged port city of Mariupol have apparently surrendered, Moscow has said, as the presidents of 4 countries bordering Russia head to Kyiv in a show of support for Ukraine. In one of the most critical battles of the war, Russia's defence ministry said that apparently 1,026 soldiers from Ukraine's 36th Marine Brigade, including 162 officers, have voluntarily laid down their arms near the city's Ilyich Iron and Steel Works. There is no independent confirmation of the claim as yet. Ukrainian Defence Ministry said it has no information about the surrender of the Ukrainian Military Command, who said that only the Russian forces were attacking the Azovstal industrial area and port. The city, the main target yet to be brought under Russian control in the eastern Donbass region, has been encircled and largely reduced to rubble during Moscow's 7-week invasion. The city's mayor has said that 21,000 civilians have died. Its capture would mark the first fall of a major Ukrainian city and would help Russia to secure the land passage between the self-proclaimed republics in Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass and Crimea, which Moscow occupied and annexed in 2014. The Polish and Baltic presidents headed to the Ukrainian capital by train today to show support for the country's president Volodymyr Zelensky and his embattled troops in what the Polish presidential advisor Jakub Kumosz called this decisive moment for the country. Polish President Andrzej Duda, Estonia's Alar Karis, Gitanas Nausėda from Lithuania, and Latvia's Eglis Ledvits met in the Polish city of Rzeszów near the Ukrainian border, heading to Kyiv with a strong message of political support and military assistance, Nausėda tweeted from the station. The programme of the visit by the leaders of the 4 NATO member states, who fear they may face Russian attacks if Ukraine falls, was not disclosed for security reasons, but would focus on ways to assist civilians and the military in Ukraine, as well as investigations of war crimes, said a spokesperson for the Estonian presidency. President Biden said he yesterday, of course, accused Russia of genocide, as we quoted earlier, saying that the very idea of being Ukrainian is being doubted by the Russian presidents. So just quickly on that one, because we don't know, of course, if Mariupol is going to be able to hold up. But looking at news reports today, I do read that there seems to be no supplies, no ammunition. So I guess it looks like a surrender looks very likely and on the cards. Richard, do you think this is going to be the completion of Putin's plan B? Presumably plan A was to take over the whole of Ukraine and put his new administration into Kyiv. That's not happening. So plan B seems to be just to capture the east of the country. Do you think he's going to be successful in that plan?
I honestly don't know, Hugh, but I sincerely hope he isn't. I mean, the situation round about Mariupol looks desperate. I mean, the war's been going on for 7 weeks in its current phase, albeit Russia clearly invaded Ukraine and occupied parts of it in 2014. But the current phase of the conflict has been going on for 7 weeks. And if you look at the maps that are being published, it certainly looks as if Mariupol is surrounded, and it's been surrounded for some time. And it's hard to see how supplies get in by land or by sea, even though it is a port city. So the situation there with 21,000 civilians dead, as you highlighted, it's hard to see. It's easy to believe that the military situation there for the Ukrainians is becoming extremely difficult. But, the only reports that we've had of this have come from the Russians, so therefore I'm naturally disinclined to believe what's being said there. But in terms of whether or not how Putin's going to try and reframe victory, I mean, obviously he controls Russian state media with an iron fist, and I don't think there's any doubt this is not an operation that has gone to plan. I think he imagined that the Russian forces would be welcomed as liberators, and they weren't. Clearly. So I think he's now having to rapidly redraw the terms of that engagement, not least as the body bags start to return to Russia and start to subvert that narrative that he's putting across on state media. And yes, while he clearly doesn't have the military capacity to take and hold significant amounts of territory in Ukraine, let alone the whole country, I think that the supply lines and the proximity to Russian territory that nobody disputes within Russia's own borders would suggest that trying to show an enhanced level of occupation, having recognised, even though nobody else has, the independence of the two parts of Ukraine that it currently part occupies, being able to show an increase in territory and being able to capture a significant tranche of land reaching round to the Crimea, I think that will be what is reframed as success should he be able to manage it. But in order to do that, he's going to have to do an awful lot more than capture Mariupol. And I think there are some interesting indications that Russia's logistical difficulties in military terms continue, even with the ending of the operations in the north of the Ukraine.
Yes, I have read several reports to suggest that one of the successes of the Ukrainian defending forces has been in targeting supply lines. Just simply blowing up a diesel depot, for instance, can completely halt in advance after they run out of diesel every 20 miles or so. Those tanks have rotten fuel consumption. Well, no doubt we'll be returning to that, and tomorrow I will report if we've got any updates on whether that surrender of Mariupol has actually been confirmed. Let's move back closer to home now, Richard. So the latest in the scandal about the Prime Minister Johnson having been at parties while everyone else was locked down. I'm trying to avoid using the word partygate, so I'm not going to use that again tonight. Illegal parties. Conservative MPs have called Boris Johnson's position untenable after the Prime Minister was fined by the Metropolitan Police for breaching lockdown rules, while Cabinet Ministers have rallied to defend Mr Johnson. Nigel Mills, the MP for Amber Valley in Derbyshire, became the latest to call for the Prime Minister to resign, although several other critics of Mr Johnson have said that they will not push for a vote of no confidence because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In a letter to a constituent, Mr Mills is reported to have said, "I don't think Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister is tenable after breaking the rules his government put in place. Those leading the country must have the highest standards, and therefore, as a result of these fines, I believe his position to be Prime Minister has become untenable." Former Cabinet Minister Caroline Noakes confirmed to a constituent that she had already submitted a letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister. Another Conservative MP, Gary Streeter, who had already submitted a letter of no confidence, says his position is unchanged. However, some of those who had previously submitted letters of no confidence include Sir Roger Gale, Andrew Bridgen and the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross, who said now was not the time to change leader given the instability caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Cabinet ministers moved to back Boris Johnson. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said Mr Johnson was mortified that he had broken the rules by having a birthday gathering in the Cabinet room. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak was also given a fixed penalty notice by police for attending the gathering. Some Conservative MPs previously suggested a line would be crossed by allowing a Prime Minister to remain in office if he was found to have broken the law. About 20 to 30 MPs were at one point thought to have submitted letters of no confidence, with 54 needed to trigger a leadership challenge. Now, Richard, last night Maggie dealt with this question of is it dangerous to change Prime Minister in the middle of an international conflict, and of course that's happened loads of times, so we don't need to go over that question again. But the other question that Douglas Ross raised this morning as he was defending his own position, which of course has changed, and Douglas Ross said that it would be very complicated, time-consuming and difficult to change a Prime Minister now, because the country would have to wait until the Conservative Party organised a new leadership election. So is that a good argument to use?
Oh, well, that's all right then. As you were, sorry to have troubled you. We'll just get on and forget any of this happened. I mean, what a load of absolute rancid nonsense, arrant nonsense from Douglas Ross. I mean, the internal workings and Kremlinology of the Conservative and Unionist Party are of absolutely no consequence whatsoever in this affair. And it's not about cakes, it's not about parties, it's now about the lies, the deceptions, the evasions, and the lack of trust and integrity that there is at the heart of Downing Street. And the Conservatives knew damned fine that Boris Johnson was unfit for office before he became Prime Minister. But yet they elevate him, they sustain him. Even after this, they still support him. He is completely unfit to be Prime Minister, and it taints and stains and contaminates every single person, Douglas Ross included, who chooses to abase themselves by supporting, even in a qualified sense, this apology, this abomination of a Prime Minister. Now, the fact of the matter is, in constitutional terms, there is always effectively a Prime Minister. As soon as Boris Johnson hands in his resignation, if he ever is forced to or comes to the conclusion that he has to, basically he would hand in his resignation. He would resign to the Queen, and the palace would then send for whoever could next stood the best chance of forming a government. Now, they wouldn't do that just by picking a name at random. Those discussions would happen through the usual channels, through the Cabinet Secretary as the chief civil servant in the UK, who would presumably have a good understanding through discussions with the Tory chief whip and about who could potentially keep that rabble united in the House of Commons. So whether Douglas Ross or even Boris Johnson likes it or not, nobody is indispensable. Johnson would go and somebody would be sent for who would then be the Prime Minister in the intervening period. That might titularly be Dominic Raab, who's supposed to be the Deputy Prime Minister, but somebody would be the Prime Minister while the Conservatives sorted themselves out. But frankly, the state of the process of decision-making within the Conservative Party is absolutely of no consequence whatsoever to what needs to happen here if leaders need to be changed, as they do. And quite frankly, the other argument that Boris Johnson has to stay because there's a crisis is just absolute bilge water. And I think it just shows how low some people are prepared to go in order to try and support Boris Johnson. It shows how low they're prepared to go, that they're apparently willing to try and hide behind the horrors of what is happening in Ukraine to try and justify that man's presence in Downing Street. He needs to go, and he needs to go now, and the Conservative Party should stop lying about the facts and the circumstance around this, because we can see it plainly for ourselves.
Yes, and Nicola Sturgeon made that point today also, that it's no use hiding behind the tragedy in Ukraine. Now, on that point, we've also heard a couple of quick snap opinion polls were published, came out this morning, and they showed a majority of Scots think that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak should resign for breaking the law. Polling by YouGov found that 2/3, that's 67% of people in Scotland, and a majority, 57% across the whole of Britain, think that Boris Johnson should resign after being fined for breaching his own lockdown laws. The poll also found that 82% of Scots think the Prime Minister knowingly lied about breaking the law, and 2/3, again that's 68%, think that Rishi Sunak also should resign. Separately, polling by Opinium found that 58% of people across the UK think Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak both should resign, and 58% think that the Prime Minister deliberately lied. Commenting, your colleague Ian Blackford, SNP leader in Westminster, said, "The Tories are showing they're completely out of touch by arrogantly enabling Boris Johnson to remain in office despite lying to the public, misleading Parliament and breaking the law." Ian Blackford concluded, "The Prime Minister must be held to an account. An empty apology doesn't cut it. When families are making huge sacrifices to obey Boris Johnson's laws, when they were making huge sacrifices, he was breaking them and lying about it. It doesn't get more serious." So I guess in politics, really, the final judge and jury is the voters. And so the voters in Scotland are showing, well, I'm just wondering how Douglas Ross is going to survive the elections that are coming up in 3 weeks' time. So this is maybe great news for Labour. Labour going to shoot forward to become the second party in Scotland.
Well, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, but yeah, I mean, Douglas Ross has left himself without any shred of credibility whatsoever. I mean, I think it just goes to show that actually when Jacob Rees-Mogg referred to him as being seen as a lightweight figure, he was absolutely right. There is just there's no justification for the U-turn that he's done on this, and he just shows himself to be, a gob on a stick, basically, that he's a man of no credibility, no substance, no principle, no bottom whatsoever. And I think that explains, at least in part, why Labour are snapping at their heels and why the council campaign leaflet that I got through my door from the Conservatives earlier today, it's all talking about being the anti-SNP party rather than anything that they might usefully do on Aberdeenshire Council. So, yeah, I think he's, by their deeds they shall be known. And as I said earlier, I think anyone that defends him, who sallies out to defend them or tries to keep their head below the parapet, as some others are doing, eventually Boris Johnson will take the whole lot down. I mean, the Conservatives will still get they'll still have a core vote. There's a bedrock through which they will not fall. But I think that I don't think anyone who intends to vote Conservative and Unionist in this election can any longer entertain any pretence, even to themselves, that it's for honesty, dignity, decency or integrity in politics. It is just about it's either out of habit or the gut visceral, not the SNP vote. But there is absolutely no virtue, I think, can be found in the present Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party or the UK Conservative and Unionist Party. They are utterly bereft in this situation, and they deserve to be smashed on the rocks of public contempt at this election and the elections that follow. One final thought: can we imagine what Douglas Ross would be saying right now if this situation was reversed and it was Nicola Sturgeon who'd been served with a fixed penalty notice for doing something similar? We would not be hearing the end of it. And that just shows the rank hypocrisy at the heart of this, that he was calling, in another set of circumstances, he was calling for Nicola Sturgeon to resign for apparently misleading Parliament, even though she was, before a report had been published, even though she was subsequently clear of that. And yet when it's now as plain as a pikestaff that the Prime Minister has lied, has broken the law, has lied to Parliament, has lied to the country, he's supinely and obsequiously giving him his backing because now is apparently not the time. Just no. Just go. Get off now.
Okay, so let's leave the party of law and order aside for a minute and move on to the economy. As everybody knows, prices are going up. Now, the UK government has been accused of failing to protect families from the cost of living crisis, with new figures out today revealing that inflation grew to 7% in March, and that's a 30-year high. The SNP warned that without significant UK government intervention, the figure, which doesn't yet take into account the 54% increase in the energy price cap this month, will increase astronomically, exacerbating people's fears over the spiralling cost of living crisis. To combat the rising cost of living and help families through the crisis, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor, your colleague Alison Thewlis, MP, called on the Tories to uplift benefits and the national minimum wage to reflect rising costs and pressures. The Glasgow Central MP also reiterated her calls for a reversal to the universal credit cuts and demanded the Tories turn their energy support loan, that's a £200 loan, into a grant. Commenting, Alison Thurles MP said, with inflation rising to a staggering 30-year high, the Tory cost of living crisis continues to spiral out of control with no sign of the UK government stepping up to the challenge to protect families and households. The reality is that the Prime Minister and Chancellor are too distracted by scandals to get on with the day job of protecting people's incomes and livelihoods. Now, Richard, on the cost of living crisis, I noticed that Chancellor Sunak, when he wasn't defending himself for going to the famous party, was saying that the Conservative government is doing a lot. And in fact, I was led to the leaflet online summarises something like 12 bullet points, and they say this is 22 billion worth of handouts. And that includes the £200, which mentioned there, and it includes things like the tapering of the universal credit and the increase in the threshold before the increase in national insurance. That's not giving back money, is it? That's just saying we're going to take off the money in a slightly different way. But anyway, he says that we're already doing 22 billion. Now, what do you make of the kind of response that the Chancellor's making to the cost of living crisis? Does that add up to a lot of money?
I think it amounts to a lot of money collectively, but individually it's not touching the sides. And I think that's part of the Chancellor's political problems that we're building even before his wife's non-dom tax status and the issue of their green cards emerged, let alone the latest developments over the last day or so. He went into that spring statement with financial headroom of around £30 billion from tax revenues that were unexpectedly high and from a level of borrowing that had been forecast but which remained unexpectedly lower than what had been forecast. So all told, that amounted to a sum of about £30 billion, over and above what he'd forecast the UK's financial position would be in. And with that £30 billion, he could have done really quite a lot. Now, as Alison Thurles has said, it's been a consistent call from the SNP to increase the living wage to reverse the withdrawal of the £20 universal credit uplift that took place during the pandemic. That would alone put £1,040 back in the bank accounts and the household finances of those from whom it's been withdrawn. And also the energy loan, for that's what it is, despite what some Greg Hands, the hapless energy minister, might try to say. It is a loan, it is not a grant, and at some point, regardless as to how you move about, you're going to have to pay it back somewhere at some address. You don't get away with not paying that, it's going to be clawed back. So I'm sure they can point to a lot of money in some initiatives, some of which would have been happening anyway, which makes it look like on the surface they are taking action to tackle the cost of living crisis. My only response to that is tell it to the people who are really experiencing it at the sharp end. Those who've just seen their bills go up by, over £700 a year. Those on heating oil who are not in a regulated part of the energy market. Tell it to the folk who are not going to be able to take advantage of the 0% VAT rating that he's put on heat source pumps and solar panels simply because they're struggling to pay their energy bills as it is, let alone being able to find any money for some kind of capital outlay like that. The reality of people's experience doesn't lie, and the government is not doing nearly enough to mitigate that cost of living crisis, and we all know that they have fallen short by at least that 30 billion that they could have been intervening with in order to take the edge off this. They really, really did need to take the edge off it and put some money back into people's pockets. And whatever the idle boasts, that's just not happening on the scale that it needs to.
Yep. OK, now also on money, we're going to move on to a Brexit story. Scotland used to receive a lot of European funding, for instance, in European structural funds and regional development funds. Michael Gove promised that all of those European funds would be replaced by his shared prosperity fund. But Ivan McKee, the Scottish business minister, has said that UK government's shared prosperity fund fails to deliver the promised funding to Scotland following the UK's exit from the European Union. New arrangements published today will see 32 million allocated to Scotland in this financial year, 22-23. 32 million compared with 183 million estimated from the European structural funds. That's a shortfall of 151 million. Since 2016, ministers have tried to engage constructively with the UK government to ensure the shared prosperity fund aligned with the Scottish government's national aims and ambitions. However, Scottish ministers have been given no role in deciding how funding is allocated and which projects would deliver the maximum benefits. Mr McKee says this undermines a devolution settlement and does not recognise the authority of the Scottish Government in devolved areas. So I suppose there's two issues here, Richard. There is obviously less money. Yeah, we used to get a lot of European money, and now that's about a sixth of it on these figures today. But the other issue, of course, is who decides. The European money, I think, generally went to Edinburgh, didn't it, for Scottish ministers to decide. But this money, it's up to Michael Gove to decide. So it's really all about centralising power in London, isn't it?
To a very large extent, that's exactly what it is. But one of the things that was a feature of the European funding streams is that it was very much a done with arrangement rather than a done to arrangement. There were very, very broad headings under which funding could be allocated. And while the Scottish Government had an administrative role in that, it was still open for local authorities or local partnerships to bid into that process. So you had that grassroots involvement very much in the process. That is not a new thing, as though Michael Gove would like us to pretend that it is as part of that. But also, with the involvement of the Scottish Government, it meant that there was a clear line of governance, and it was in line with the strategic objectives of governments that had been democratically elected by the people of Scotland. So they were able to ensure that the funding that did come to Scotland, it was engaged in meeting broader strategic priorities that had been identified by the appropriate levels of government and endorsed by the voters. And instead, what we're now getting is, it's part of a unionist panic that we're seeing, that been driving around Scotland for years, seeing Scottish flags from the Scottish Government as part of the government logo. They're not there gratuitously. And this project has been funded in partnership with the Scottish Government and the European Union. And what they want to do is to start slapping Union Jacks all over things, no matter how little money the UK government has actually put forward to it. And now we're finding that the total revenue stream that is available is significantly less than it was when we were getting funded directly from the European Union. Now, I'm just about old enough to remember some of the first tranches of European funding that came to Scotland when the Highlands and Islands secured Objective 1 development funding. Now, I've got absolutely no doubt that left to its own devices, Margaret Thatcher's government would have done absolutely zip-diddly-squat hee-haw to fund many of the projects that were funded through Objective 1 funding, whether that was investment in further education, whether it was investment in infrastructure such as digitising telecommunications infrastructure, or road and communications improvements. But none of that would have happened on anything like the same scale or on the same time scale had it been left to a Tory government in London. So that bypassing of London was a good thing. Now we're being channeled on a B road through London, and less resources are coming out, and those that are highly politicised. We've had Douglas Ross, our old friend again, claiming that a vote for the Conservatives means that Scotland will have a better chance to get some of this money. That's just an absolutely disgraceful statement, and also it's disgracefully untrue. I live in a part of the country where the council, unfortunately, is excuse me, led by the Conservatives. When it comes to the Levelling Up Fund, Aberdeenshire Council has been placed in the lowest priority category. So their propaganda just does not stand up. But no, we're being badly shortchanged by this, and devolution is being undermined.
Yeah, now you use the phrase short change there, so if maybe you get a drink of water while I go through the next list, because your colleagues in the SNP have been doing some number crunching, and they've said today that a litany of figures, as they put it, amounting to over £10 billion expose how successive Westminster governments have shortchanged Scotland. The statistics show it's still going on with outstanding debts to be paid, and Scotland also having to pay for being shortchanged by Brexit. So among the list of items the SNP have produced is £421 million in underfunding of city deals, £1.3 billion in promised but not delivered. I've just lost my notes there. Promised but not delivered EU funding, or EU replacement funding, as we've seen. £290 million in Barnett formula consequentials for the council tax rebate. £121 million in VAT paid by the Scottish Police and Fire Services, which is not paid by services in England. £103 million in health funding shortfalls. £3 billion as Scotland's share of the Brexit divorce bill. £1.4 billion to be spent in mitigating the benefit cuts by the Westminster government. That's not money being withdrawn. That's extra money that the Scottish government has to find to mitigate those cuts. And £1 billion as a promised Tory figure for the cost of a carbon capture facility, which had previously been confirmed for location in Scotland, but which is not going ahead. That be the Fergus one, which was supposed to be delivered by what's called the ACON project. And also £2.6 billion lost over the next 5 years through the scrapping of their manifesto promise to maintain the triple lock pension. In total, that comes to £10.3 billion, or over £2,000 per person, or nearly £4,400 per household. MSP Gillian Martin said, whether it's a Brexit present, Brexit future, city deals, welfare, police, fire pensions or NHS, there's one constant. The Tories will always shortchange Scotland. It's the same lesson again and again. Westminster control means cuts, not cash. So that this is really the economic argument, isn't it? Why the Scottish government says we need to be in charge of these things. It's often described as a heart or a head argument, isn't it? That if you vote for independence in Scotland, it's because of your brave heart spirit, but the mathematics say you should stay with the Union. So the SNP is saying, no, actually, that's not what the mathematics say at all. Is that what the SNP is getting at?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think what it shows quite eloquently is the mismatch between the UK government's rhetoric and what it actually delivers, and also shows the impact of some of its choices. It shows the lack of fitness for purpose of the devolved funding settlement, that spending decisions that are taken in England are the only thing that release funding in the mainstream, which releases funding for Scotland from Westminster, but often announcements are made and then the Treasury decides, oops, we've made a mistake, we're not going to pay you that after all, which, given that we're supposed to have a funding formula, makes you wonder how it can sometimes take days for them to actually make good or not on promises that have been made by ministers. Some of it is just pure vandalism and spitefulness, like the VAT bills for Scotland's emergency services, apparently because they are national forces or organisations that exempts them from VAT, even though both the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and Police Scotland are smaller entities than the Metropolitan Police in terms of the population areas that they respectively cover. You start to look at things like the way that the welfare system works and funding that has been removed or changes to pension payments, and it all stacks up to that figure of £10 billion that you've been shown. And I'm sure that with ingenuity, a great deal more could be found, which could be put into that. So, absolutely, I think what it does show for me is not just how Scotland is being shortchanged by policy decisions and sometimes just simple acts of spite in terms of withholding monies that have been promised, but also what it really shows for me is how the funding formula does not work for Scotland. One of the best arguments that you can have for independence isn't about the brave heart. It's the democratic argument, obviously, about that the best people to make decisions about how Scotland should be run are those who've chosen to make their lives here. But there's a fundamental, more technocratic argument than that, which is that the best outcomes for people are delivered when decisions are taken locally and when policy decisions are matched with the resources locally. That's what independence would give us with that financial autonomy, where we'd be restricted only by the limits of our own resources, our own decision making, our own talents, and our own imagination, and not restricted by the limitations or choices of anyone else anywhere else. That's one of the fundamentals for independence, and quite apart from the highlighting of how badly Scotland is being shortchanged by these decisions, I think that's the logical conclusion that we need to draw people towards, that when we match up policy with resources, with local accountable decision making within Scotland, we stand a much better chance of getting better outcomes. And that's the nub of the independence argument for me.
Okay, we're going to move on to the energy market now, and maybe that could be the sort of thing that the Scottish Government could intervene in if it had the power to do so, because we've heard a story today that the prices for wind and solar power in the major global markets have climbed nearly 30% a year as developers have struggled with chaotic supply chains and surging costs for everything from shipping parts to labour, according to a new report which was published today, Wednesday. Contract prices for renewables jumped by 28.5% in North America and 27.5% in Europe in the last year. This is according to a quarterly index by Level 10 Energy, which tracks the deals known in the industry as the purchasing power agreements. In the first quarter alone, prices rose by 9.7% in North America and 8.6% in Europe, Level 10 said. Economic, logistical and labour market disruptions during the coronavirus pandemic have worsened since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, reversing a decade of cost declines for the renewable energy sector. There's a risk that higher costs could slow demand growth at a time when the United Nations has called for clean energy to expand more rapidly to avoid the worst effects of the warming climate. In Europe, the war in Ukraine has led to governments to try to reduce dependence on natural gas from Russia, further boosting the robust demand for renewables. So what struck me here, Richard, is that even countries which produce renewable energy will have to pay more for it because the world prices have gone up. Would this be an example where, had it the power, the Scottish Government should intervene and maybe make energy like water, something that you need, and it should just be provided at cost?
Well, that's one part of it. And if you've got wholesale energy markets, then there is going to be a spot price for electricity, however it is generated. So unless you segregate your market, then that's always going to be a feature. Now, there's no reason why you can't segregate your market like that. If you look at the way the French are operating at the moment, EDF, French a utility that is substantially owned, I believe, by the French government. EDF customers in the UK are seeing their energy prices go up by somewhere in the region of about 54%, whereas in France, EDF customers are having to pay an increase of about 4% mandated by the French government, and EDF and their shareholders will have to take the hit. So having that political power and the ability to regulate that market can make all the difference. Of course, if we were doing that for ourselves in Scotland as an independent country, we certainly wouldn't be paying the ridiculous grid charges that currently see Scottish generators having to pay around £400 million a year to access the grid, while generators in England are subsidised to the tune of about £30 million annually. But I think one of the things about this price increase is it's a reflection of the general inflation that's out there, that the cost of materials needed to build the machinery that you generate renewables from, that's going to experience a cost increase. The rare metals that are involved in manufacturing wind turbines, their costs are going to increase. The cost of labour is going to inevitably have to increase as well. So when there's global constraints on supply, that impacts the price. So it's not just the price of the energy that can command a higher price. It's that many generators are going to have to charge a bit more to cover the costs of maintaining their existing infrastructure, as well as for expanding it. But the flip side of that is, of course, gas prices have gone up by about 100%. So the cost of everything is going up. But fundamentally, we know we've got a cost of energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a looming environmental crisis. We know the role that hydrocarbons have to play for many years to come in meeting our energy balance and delivering our energy security. That's not in question, I don't think. But fundamentally, we still need to make that dash for renewables. And even if the cost of doing so is going up, the cost of meeting your energy needs, whether that's a financial cost or an environmental cost from other sources, is we also know what that cost is, and it doesn't change the fundamental calculus of the need to make that move to renewables for energy security and environmental security.
Yes, I did speak to Patrick Harvey yesterday, who reminded us that nuclear is actually the most expensive. And now I noticed today that EDF Energy in France are actually moving into nuclear, but presumably they're getting subsidised. But nuclear isn't quick and it isn't cheap, according to Patrick Harvey. So now, just keeping my eye on the clock here, we better move on. Now, there's an interesting story today that down in Ayrshire, a private healthcare hospital has been taken over by the NHS Ayrshire and Arran to become part of a network of 10 national treatment centres. These are the NTCs. Carrickglen Clinic has been purchased for 1.8 billion and will be the NTC for Ayr, specialising in orthopaedics. The NTC programme is a key pillar of planned NHS recovery and, 1.8 million, is that what I said? 1.8 million Ayr and Ayr NHS has paid for that. The NTCs, anyway, is a part of the planned NHS recovery. And once fully operational, this network of centres will deliver capacity for over 40,000 additional surgeries and procedures each year. Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf announced the purchase during his visit to the University Hospital Ayr today, where he met staff and patients at the Orthopaedics Services Department. The NHS Recovery Plan increased investment in NTCs to more than 400 million, in addition to the Golden Jubilee Eye Centre, which opened in November 21, and a Phase 2 expansion of the Golden Jubilee due to open in 23. This network of NTCs will include the centres of Fife, Forth Valley, Highland, Grampian, Tayside and Lothian. The two additional centres in Ayrshire and Cumbernauld announced last year, and the replacement of the Edinburgh Eye Pavilion will create a network of 10 centres in total. So I was reminded when I read this story today of Boris Johnson promising English voters 40 new hospitals. So have you heard from your English colleagues how they're coming along?
Well, they're not, because they don't exist. I think sometimes, putting up a new pair of curtains in a hospital ward is being counted as part of that 40. So, while there will be the odd new hospital goes up, some of it is about refurbishment of existing facilities. Some of it is about, just a slight extension. It is not 40 new hospitals. It's just another Boris Johnson lie, which, people will find out for themselves about sooner or later. But, I think this is good news. I think the private healthcare market in Scotland is clearly there, but it's always seemed to me to depend very, very heavily on NHS demand and NHS resources in terms of trying to, operations being purchased in order to bring down NHS waiting lists, and also personnel who would habitually work in the NHS. So it's no surprise to see part of what was a private hospital coming into the NHS fold here, and if its capacity is to be used as is stated to help with particular procedures to help bring down waiting lists, I think that's a good thing, particularly for two reasons. One, we've seen the success of that with the Golden Jubilee Hospital in Clydebank, which started life as Healthcare International, private hospital for which was hoping to attract overseas patients. Ultimately, the economics of that didn't stack up, and it's now a very worthwhile addition to Scotland's National Health Service. But also, coming out of the pandemic, we know that we've got a massive backlog of treatments, from anything from dealing with cancers to dealing with orthopaedics. It's going to take a long time and an awful lot of dedication and resource and effort to help get our healthcare collectively, nationally, back to where it needs to be in terms of our physical well-being. And I think it's good that the Scottish Government has recognised that and has committed to increasing the capacity of our NHS to do that through the network of national treatment centres, and the fact that this one is going to be opening to serve the west of Scotland and presumably the southwest as well, I think is a very much a good thing and very much to be welcomed.
Okay, so that's in addition to the NHS in Scotland of the new National Treatment Centre, that one in Ayr. Now, next story, we'll just quickly run over this one, Richard. We hear today that new measures to revitalise town centres and regenerate local economies has been published. In response to last year's review of the Town Centre Action Plan, a joint report by the Scottish Government and COSLA outlines actions to better embed a town centre first approach, as they call it, to meet the needs of communities and to tackle climate change. Actions include ensuring town centre regeneration contributes to climate action by reducing emissions, investing in low-carbon transport and creating more green spaces. Secondly, making town centre services as accessible as possible to help reduce unnecessary car journeys and prevent climate change. Thirdly, to incentivise entrepreneurship by delivering the ambitions set out in the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. Fourthly, support businesses with town centre premises by exploring a new online sales tax that helps traditional businesses compete with those operating online. Next, using the planning system to limit out-of-town development and to ensure our non-domestic rates system continues to support our net zero ambitions by providing relief for the businesses generating more energy from their renewable sources. Sixth, require developers to install and optimise digital connectivity in new town centre housing developments, and support community organisations by delivering digital skills training. So regenerating town centres, as you go around Europe, really anywhere, I think town centres have the same problems. Town centres are closing, and it's because of online and out-of-town shopping. So maybe about time, shouldn't we have been doing this 10 years ago?
Well, arguably, yes. I think there's an awful lot in the measures that you read out there that are tremendously worthwhile. But I mean, don't forget that the Scottish Government did make a significant investment in town centres when the Scottish Government, when the SNP introduced the small business bonus scheme that exempted an awful lot of high street traders in our smaller towns from paying any business rates at all. So I think that has been a tremendous boost. I think it's right that we look at other ways that we can leverage that business rate system to incentivise the sort of changes that we want to see. I think that looking at an online sales tax is important. There are companies who trade online who've done exceptionally well throughout the pandemic, but if they're not saddled with the cost of paying business rates or renting a property, then they've got an advantage over those geographically located traders that choose to have a presence in our town centres. Our town centres have to change, but we want them to be viable, vibrant places for us to, as the confectionery advert went, to work, rest and play. It's where people come together post-pandemic, having places where people want to come together and enjoy a positive environment, whether that's to work, whether it's to shop or whether it's to rest and enjoy their leisure time. It's really, really important, and that sounds like a solid package of measures to further support our traders and the environments within our town centres to be the sort of places that we want to spend our time and our money in the future.
Yeah, but part of it now looks like it's beginning to use tax incentives to alter behaviour, move behaviour in the right direction. I also read today that Edinburgh City is considering bringing in a tourist tax. I think it's just a couple of quid, but the whole idea is trying to use tax in a kind of creative way, if you like. Anyway, I must move on now. We've just got one final story, Richard. We hear today that thousands of families are saving around £4,900 annually thanks to funded early learning and childcare, that's ELC, from the Scottish Government. The latest figures show that 111,574 children were in funded ELC places at the end of January this year, and that's an increase of 23% of 20,000 since August 21. Of these, 80%, that's 97,800 children, were taking advantage of the full 1,140 hours of funded ELC a year. This is a total saving to families which is estimated to be worth 4,900 per annum. Now, I noticed earlier on Rishi Sunak in his list of bullet points says he's helping families get into work, but surely this is the way to do that. Childcare, of course, is one of the barriers to work, especially for women who might want to return to workforce. So childcare is essential, isn't it, if you want to encourage that return to work?
Well, it is. I mean, my partner and I, we've got two children. They're out with they're both at primary school now, so they're out with the scope of this. But had they been young enough to take advantage, what a difference that would have made to us. Because at times it felt like we were often working to pay for the childcare to let us go out and earn just a little bit more, and it would have been an absolute game changer for us, and I'm sure it would be an absolute game changer for many families. It'll let whichever parent has the primary caring responsibility, or even if both parents are sharing it equally, it will allow families to make more choices about how they want to spend their time. Some will choose to go out and work if they have that opportunity. Other families might have other caring responsibilities, but at the point, or they may want to go out and do some community work. But it's good for parents, it's good for the children who get to meet their other children of a similar age and get that different stimulation outside the family environment as well for a few hours a week. So I think it's a tremendously positive thing. It's a game-changing commitment, and it allows us to fully release the potential that's there in the work, those who want to be active in the workforce but who feel because they can't meet childcare costs, they felt in the past that they couldn't meet childcare costs, that they had no option but to stay at home. So game changing, and an example of how you can use social policy to really drive forward the economic and social benefits that are there that can be there for everyone in the country. And I think it shines a beacon. There's a beacon of contrast between what can be done with limited powers of devolution and how little Westminster politicians are minded to do when it comes to helping families with the cost of living crisis. Of course, this is something that we should be doing whether there's a cost of living crisis or not, because it's a simple matter of social justice and increasing equality. And this is the sort of thing, imaginative, forward-looking, positive, progressive policy that we can enact even within the constraints of devolution. Just imagine what more we could do if we had the full powers over tax and welfare and the economy that only come with independence.
That's right. It's all done, all constrained, of course, by the Scottish Government's budget, which is fixed. But that's 1,140 hours of funded childcare available to parents in Scotland. And that's our final story tonight. So, Richard, thanks for joining me. I've just got a couple of things I'd like to say in winding up. First of all, we're going to ask our readers to do us a favour. If you use social media, could you help to spread it around, please? If you have a tweet from Broadcasting Scotland, please pass it on. And maybe Richard and his many tens of thousands of followers on Twitter. Do you use Twitter, Richard?
I do. I don't like it particularly, but it's a necessary evil in politics, and I use it as best I can.
In some ways, yes. I only use it politely.
I always retweet Broadcasting Scotland things as well. So,
thank you. All the smart people do, Richard. Thank you very much. And finally, of course, just to remind everyone that we don't receive any public funding from the Scottish or any other government. So I don't know if that's liable to change. But at the moment, we, of course, also have our electricity bills to pay. And, of course, we would like to expand the range of programming. And our promise is, if we get more money in, more programmes will come out. So please have a look at the list below at the link and go to broadcastingscotland.scot, and it really would be great to have you on board as a contributor, as a supporter, and also as a viewer. So finally, thanks very much to Richard Thomson for joining me tonight, and thank you for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow. Goodbye.